her cell phone out, and as a handheld, being very D.H. Pennebaker about the whole thing, recorded it on video, which we put on Facebook. And that worked pretty well. So we've gone, because I forgot to press this button, we now have this elaborate tripod here, and Ruth on her way to a new career as a videographer. So. And also just for I'm turning it on now. So I'm halfway there, if I can only remember to turn it off. I grew up in the same general neighborhood as Gloria Steiner, outside of Toledo. She grew up a little closer to the city, in a little urban area. I grew up about 5 miles east, where it becomes quickly more rural. The area all around the Great Lakes is swampland. That's why the name of the baseball team is the Mud Hens, because that's the birds that are there. And the terrain, at least for a few miles close to the lake, is like the meadowlands. It's wetlands. It's marshlands. And I would say that the real bird there, state bird, should be the mosquito as a result. But sometimes people wonder, because of the location, why is Toledo part of Ohio and not of Michigan? Because the terrain and the populace is so forth is much more similar to more of the swampy Michigan terrain than the more rural farmland in Ohio. And historically, it goes back to the French came down and settled the Detroit area. That's why it's called Detroit. And the British came sort of due west and settled around Ohio. So at one point, before they were actually states, Michigan and Detroit fought a war for Toledo. And Michigan won the war, and that's why Toledo is part of Ohio. A few miles south, where the marshland turns to something a little more solid, for many, many, many centuries, there was a path that went from the whole length of Lake Erie, from the farthest west, which is about where I live, all the way through Cleveland and on up into Erie and up into almost the Finger Lakes. And the path was described by the land. It was the closest to the lake you could get that would be dry year-round, right? In other words, it's the edge of the wetlands. That's where the path was. If the path would have been even 100 yards closer, it would be swampy. It would be flooded out part of the time. So that's what that became for a long time. And eventually, that path became Ohio Route 2. Because naturally, when people started their wagons and their horses, they would follow this old Indian path that was the nearest to the lake that would be passable all year round. That's where I grew up. I have a photo of my grandfather somewhere in the 30s watching that road being blacktopped and paved. So before that, it was a dirt path, and then in the 30s, it became, you can see the brick, and then there's workmen with some awful sort of belching machine that I think was laying down the tar on top of it. When I grew up, it was a 2-lane blacktop and got a lot of traffic. Our house was situated about 100 yards back from it. And I spent a lot of my childhood mowing with a not power mower, a very large front lawn between our house and where Route 2 was. But Route 2 got a lot of traffic. We would get military carriers going back and forth to Erie Ordnance. We would get all sorts of 16-wheelers carrying freight and so forth. And that's what I remember. And then in about 2002, the road was finally expanded into 4 lanes. And the house where I grew up and the house where my father grew up next to it in the barns were all obliterated. My family had since moved away, but the buildings were there until it was expanded to 4 lanes, and then there's nothing there. I was back there last month for the first time in 10 years, and I drove by there, and it was very sad because there's no trace that anybody had lived there. I think what I would have to do, I would have to park my car along the side of the road and walk back several hundred yards to the remaining sort of forest right in the middle of the block to see anything that would have given a memory that I had been there. And my family moved there probably in the 1870s. They originally lived a little closer to where Gloria Steinem grew up, and then the next generation moved out to the country, bought several hundred acres out there, and it was divided up to the family since then. And my father had 10 acres on that home place, that home property. But of course I realized that the Berger family was not the first people who lived there, the evidence of whom had been obliterated. As long as I can remember, there was a tin. It would have been for buttons, I think. Those of you who remember when people had button tins that were about this big. It was full of arrowheads that my father had personally taken out of the ground when he was plowing as a boy in the late 20s and early 30s. And he had collected them. They went from this size to, about this long, and there were 2 or 3 very smooth stones of basalt, which I suspect were used as pestles, to ground corn or something. He had them since he was a kid, and I remember seeing them. And of course, growing up in the 50s, I was really into cowboys and Indians, and the fact that we had some real Indian arrowheads, I thought was surpassingly cool. And for a long time, I thought of those as being artifacts of the 19th century. That the Indians would have used them about the same times that the cowboys were using their Colts, or maybe when Davy Crockett was using his flintlocks. And then later, when I started attending places like the Native American Museum back when it was uptown in Manhattan, I realized, no. Yes, the Indians of the 17th century might have used some of those arrowheads, but also the Indians of the 15th century and the 14th, because a good arrowhead you keep. A good arrowhead is one that is sharp and actually does the job. So when it kills that deer or kills that rabbit, and you get that, you say, oh boy, that's a good one. I'm saving that one. And so I realized some of these arrowheads were way, way older than I possibly could originally have imagined. And that's the way it is with a lot of things around here, if you get down to it. America is the European name for this landmass. The natives called it, many of them in different languages, called it Turtle Island. That is, they were aware that it was alive and that it moved very slowly. And I've always thought we should call ourselves Turtle Island again. It has I think it would help us be aware of what we need to do. It would help us be aware of our real relationship to the land. America, is in fact sort of the landmass equivalent of a name like Cassius Clay or Malcolm Little. It's commonly held that North America became democratic because it was colonized by England, and South and Central America became autocratic because it was colonized by Spain. Now, certainly the colonization of this land by Europeans changed it forever and significantly, but we often don't consider how much the Europeans were changed by their coming here. That is, consider for a moment that North America became democratic until very recently because of the Iroquois, and South and Central America became autocratic because of the Aztecs. The first colonial representative to the Iroquois Confederacy was a man named Cadwallader Colden. And I'd like to suggest, if any of you are planning to have children or have children who are planning to have grandchildren, I recommend the name Cadwallader to you. I guarantee it will be the only Cadwallader. When you call out for them, Cadwallader, come home, that person, after hating you briefly, will come home. Cadwallader Colden wrote this in 1727. He wrote the first book about the Iroquois Native American culture that was written by a European. He wrote the History of the Five Nations, 1527, while we were still a colony. The Indians have outdone the Romans. They have a social and political system so old that the immigrant Europeans know nothing of its origin. A federal union of 5 and later 6 Indian nations have put into practice concepts of popular participation and natural rights that the European savants have thus far only theorized. The Iroquois system, expressed through its constitution, called the Great Law of Peace, rests on assumptions foreign to the monarchies of Europe. It's agreed by historians that the Iroquois Confederacy goes back at least to the 1400s, but there is evidence in the oral tradition that it might have gone back 300 or 400 years earlier than that. We know that its leaders were servants to the tribe, not masters of the tribe. The leaders could be removed for errant behavior. There was freedom of expression and allowance for a range of social and even gender roles. Women not only participated in decision-making, the elder women chose the leaders. Let me repeat that. The women not only participated in decision-making, the elder women chose the leaders. When it comes to social change toward democracy, you often find a Unitarian and a Universalist somewhere anonymously in the mix. And there's one in this too. There is a Universalist named Benjamin Rush, or at least he was a Universalist during part of his life. And he was one of the first kind of almost scientific physicians in the colonies. He did a lot of experimenting with new kinds of drugs and new kinds of procedures. Unfortunately, he seemed to hold on to the notion of bleeding rather longer than many of his colleagues. But other than that, he's recognized as being an early scientist. And he was going out and visiting the Native Americans to look at the various plant and herb cures that they were doing. And during the course of this, he encouraged his friend, Benjamin Franklin, to consider the Iroquois system when creating a new one for the former colonies. In 1751, Franklin wrote, "We should accept the Iroquois advice to form a union in common defense under common federal government." 3 years later, he created the Albany Plan of organize the colonies in the same way as the tribes. Franklin again, "Our forefathers said the 6 nations are a wise people. Let us hearken to them and take their counsel and teach our children to follow them." Well, we are taught that democracy came from Europe. But where in Europe was there democracy in 1751? Where was religious freedom? Where was political participation of women? Hey, the first white Americans left Europe to find those freedoms amongst the dark-skinned natives here. The consequences of European colonization of Turtle Island was catastrophic for native peoples, obviously. But what was the effect on the Europeans who came here seeking freedom, and even on the Africans who came here mostly in chains? If we think of our ancestors as seeds, then they were planted in the rich soil of Turtle Island, a land of abundance and freedom and space to be, and people from all over the world have come here, and their seeds have grown, and here we are. It may be time for us to learn more from our Native American spiritual and genetic ancestors than the means of a common defense. I suggest that it may also be time for us to learn their ways of lamentation. because we took the great turtle and cracked its shell, poisoned her water, and devoured her eggs. We learned the native lessons about common defense, but not about living on the land and letting the land live. If you go through Native American oral history, you'll see there are three aspects to it: life, resistance, and death. Life represents the prehistoric long time that the natives people lived here amongst only themselves, the native in harmony with Turtle Island. They lived, as Chief Seattle said, knowing that humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread in it. Then came resistance. And some of the best military leaders ever to arise from this land were the Native Americans. Tecumseh in the east, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in the plains, Chief Joseph, who evaded the U.S. cavalry for years, crossed into Canada and voluntarily surrendered to one Canadian Mountie, Geronimo in the Southwest. And finally, the period of lamentation and death, the ghost dance from the Paiute Wovoka, the genocide, the reservations, the buried hearts at Wounded Knee, and Black Elk Speaks, the basis for the movie Little Big Man. And Chief Dan George again saying, "Have I done everything I could to earn my grandchild's fondness?" I see around me something perhaps of what those Native American eyes saw. The end of their world, their nature, their freedoms. I heard on National Public Radio earlier this week an interview with, I think, the CEO of the company drilling on the Standing Rock Sioux pipeline. And brothers and sisters, I've heard that language before. I've heard that voice before. I've heard that man before. The arrogance and the certainty and the objectivity and the bold-faced greed. When I was growing up, I didn't know of any Native Americans around. But in about the mid-1970s, there started to be Native American peoples taking political speeches, starting to share spirituality in a way that I hadn't seen before. And when I started working with some Native American leaders back in the 90s, I was told that this was entirely intentional. That there was a time in the early 70s that the natives on the reservations began to perceive a change in weather patterns due to the over-damming of the water sources in the Great Plains in the west. They saw how the changing of the flow of the water was changing the weather patterns in ways that nobody knew about. Nobody knew the consequences of them. And that's when Native American leaders intentionally decided that they had to talk about what they knew about the land because they realized how ignorant the colonizers were. And that's why you have Native American activities. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't part of any New Age thing. It was an intentional idea by the leaders to say, we have to try one more time to get through to these people. So we may need to learn how to lament from the inhabitants of Turtle Island. To understand, as they said, that death is not death, that death is part of the changing cycles of life. For we know that regardless of what happens with the Standing Rock Sioux and the pipeline, and even if the groundwaters of the Missouri are poisoned forever, The Standing Rock Sioux will abide. You know, many of the Native Americans call this time of history the colonial interval. For the words and the traditions and the spirit of the natives have not died. Perhaps ours will not die either. And perhaps our grandchildren will forgive us. And perhaps they will, in greater numbers than today, see the value and sacredness of living as part of a vastly greater interconnected web that is not there for us to use, but to love. I turned it off.